Welcome to this video, which explains use of a spreadsheet, which can be used to quickly rename EML files. EML files are native file format emails stored as plain text in the MIME format. But each EML file is basically just a text file, and you can see that if you right-click on an email and then open it with Notepad, it's just a plain text file that can be viewed in Notepad. EML format is used by various email software, including Gmail. For example, if you're in a Gmail message and you click the kebab menu on the top right and then click the download message option, it'll download an EML file. Likewise, if you check off a bunch of messages in Gmail, click the more menu item and then click forward as attachment, it'll forward all of the selected emails as attachments to a fresh email, and it'll send them in EML format. If you have EML files in Windows Explorer, they may have unhelpful file names, like the ones we see over here, and you may want to give them useful file names, ideally indicating the date, time, sender, and email subject line, with the data arranged in the file such that the files sort into date order. For example, I would change the current listing of these files to look something like this. Once the files are renamed in this way, it's easy to review them in chronological order. So available for download is a spreadsheet that contains a Visual Basic macro that performs quick renaming of EML files, such that each message file can be renamed whichever way you wish. You can also mix other text with the metadata to create the file names in the way you wish. So for example here, the yellow items are custom text that I've interspersed in amongst the metadata. I will now show some examples of the tool working in practice, and then after that I'll go through details about how to adjust settings for the tool. So coming back to the folder containing the EML files with unhelpful file names, the way to run the tool is to put the path of the folder containing the emails onto the clipboard. So I'll click up here in the address bar, press Ctrl+C to put it on the clipboard, and now I need to open the spreadsheet to run the macro. So I'll click the file name to run it, and you can see it happened very quickly, but it did already rename all of the files to have the file naming convention that I've specified on the settings page. The macro could also be run on a much larger collection of emails, but it'll take a little bit longer to run than it did in this case right now. It is also possible to run the macro on just one or two emails. So for example, if I start with a collection of files like this, I'll select just one of them, hold down the Shift key, right click, then select copy as path, and then run the macro. It'll just rename that one individual file. To show what happens if there's duplicate copies of the emails in the folder, I'll take a few of these and just make copies of them. I'll then select the entire folder path again and run the macro. And you'll see that it'll add suffixes, number suffixes, to the ends of the duplicate file names. So if it turns out you've got duplicates, you can easily focus on the suffixes and then delete the duplicate copies if you don't need them. You will have noticed that I've been opening the spreadsheet by accessing the shortcut that is pinned to the jump list associated with the Excel icon on the taskbar, but you don't need to do that. You can open the spreadsheet from anywhere, and so long as you've put a folder path or some file paths onto the clipboard, it should work to rename those files. The renaming spreadsheet does have a settings page which allows you to adjust certain aspects of how the renaming is done. If there's a folder path or file path on the clipboard when the macro runs, then you will not be able to access the settings sheet, because as we just saw a moment ago, the macro will run, it'll then shut down, and you will not be able to access the settings page. If you want the workbook to stay open so that the settings can be adjusted, then instead of putting a folder path or file path onto the clipboard, you should just put the words settings adjust onto the clipboard. Note that there's no space between the two words and no spaces before or after the phrase. But if that phrase is on the clipboard, when the macro runs, then it'll stop and allow you to access the settings. So I've just put that onto the clipboard by pressing Ctrl+C. I'll then run the macro and we'll see that it'll stop. It then has this note that because you had the text settings adjust on the clipboard, the macro is stopped to allow you to edit the settings on this page. So I'll click OK. We can come look at the settings. Starting on row 14 of the settings sheet, there is a section to deal with the issue that there are certain characters that are prohibited in file names. For example, these 9 characters are not permitted in file names on a Windows computer. But it could be that some of those characters may be included in an email subject line, so they must be filtered out when renaming files. In column D, you can specify what you want the prohibited characters to be replaced by. And if there's any other characters you want to exclude from file names, there's space here that you can list them below and also specify the characters you want those to be replaced by. Starting on row 40, there's an area to define the file name format to be applied when the files are renamed. From rows 43 to 51, there's a listing of the same metadata we saw earlier. And then starting at row 61, there's a section in yellow in which you can build out the file names using those metadata items and also any other text you wish to use. For example, I'm putting a dash between the year and the month, and also between the month and the day, and then an underscore after the day. I then follow that with the words email sent, and then the time is defined. Then I have the word by, the sender name, and then the email subject. Note that how the metadata items must be wrapped in curly brackets, because that's how the macro knows to pull that data from the metadata of the email and intersperse it with the other regular text you've got, which is not wrapped in curly brackets. On the right hand side over here, I have this additional duplicate of the content for the email subject line. That's just so that if I want to delete the email subject line information, I can do so by just selecting it and hitting delete. And if I later want to put it back in, I can just copy and paste this content on the right and put it back into column B, because it's only the content in column B that will be used to define the file names that are going to be applied by the macro. Note as well that you must include spaces before and after the text that is interspersed in amongst the metadata. For example, I'm going to want a space at the end of the seconds for the time and before the word by, so I do have that space in this cell over here before the B of the word by. After editing the settings, be sure to click Save to save the changes, and then you can shut down the workbook, put a folder path or file paths onto the clipboard so that the renaming macro runs when the file is next opened. If you ever want to further edit the settings again, just put Settings Adjust back onto the clipboard and open the spreadsheet, and you'll be brought back to the settings page. Although it's not very common, it does sometimes occur that some email programs do not correctly encode the date information in EML files. So for example, the date information should include a reference to the offset from UTC or Greenwich Mean Time. So for example, in this image over here, we can see that the date is offset from Greenwich Mean Time by 7 hours. However, if the EML file does not have the date information coded correctly, then it may just show a collection of zeros like we see over here. And in that case, it will result in the macro renaming the file with the wrong date and time information. You may find that email software like Outlook correctly detects that the date information is incomplete, and so it uses received information or other data when displaying the date information when the email is opened. But this macro simply reads out the information from the date line in the EML file, and so if that is wrong, the macro will not state the correct date or time in the file name. This is just a limitation of this relatively simple software, so do keep an eye on the date and time information in the rename files as compared to what is visible if the files are opened in an email software like Outlook. Although the renaming spreadsheet takes a few minutes to set up with your preferred settings, it can save a lot of time renaming EML files, which may be useful to you if you like to review emails in chronological order without importing them into an email software like Outlook for review. Alright, I hope you find it useful.